It was the moment no one saw coming. After years of silence, Lisa Weiss has finally stepped into the spotlight. And what she revealed about Doug Weiss and Joni Lamb is nothing short of explosive. Hidden truths, shocking betrayals, and secrets carefully buried for years have now been dragged into the open. This isn't just another scandal. It's a revelation that could shatter reputations, shake a ministry to its core, and leave their legacy in ruin. This changes absolutely everything. For years, Lisa Weiss lived in the shadows, holding together the life she thought she and Doug had built. To the outside world, their marriage looked strong, almost untouchable. Doug was the Christian marriage counselor everyone admired, the man with the books, the TV appearances, the sermons about loyalty and faithfulness. He was the expert, the one people turned to when their relationships were falling apart. But Lisa knew a different reality, one that grew heavier the longer she stayed silent. At first, she convinced herself that silence was strength. She told herself she was protecting her family, protecting Doug's ministry, protecting the image they had worked so hard to create. Whenever she felt invisible, when Doug's eyes were always on the next project instead of her, she prayed harder and told herself to be patient. She waited for him to notice, to reach back, to choose her again. But instead of reconnecting, the distance grew. The man who once shared his dreams with her now shared them with cameras, congregations, and crowds of strangers who believed he was the perfect husband. The turning point came not with one dramatic betrayal, but with a series of quiet absences that added up to something she could no longer ignore. Lisa began to realize that while she was fighting to hold on, Doug had already let go. And then came the blow that shattered the last pieces of her silence: his sudden marriage to Joni Lamb. Just months after their divorce was finalized, Doug was standing beside another woman, smiling for photographs, presenting a new love story to the world. For Lisa, it felt like her 30 years of loyalty had been erased in an instant. Breaking her silence wasn't about revenge. Lisa said it herself. She wasn't trying to destroy anyone. She was trying to reclaim her voice after years of being unseen. She spoke honestly about the pain of being left behind while Doug built his platform, about the confusion of watching him preach faithfulness while she lived in loneliness. Her words weren't polished. They weren't rehearsed. They carried the raw ache of a woman who had given everything and received silence in return. When Lisa finally spoke, people listened. Some were shocked, others skeptical, but no one could ignore the calm conviction in her voice. She wasn't out to win an argument. She was out to tell the truth, her truth, even if it made others uncomfortable. And in doing so, she took the first step toward healing, reminding herself and the world that she was no longer invisible. She had a voice, and she was finally ready to use it. When Doug Weiss and Joni Lamb stood side by side and announced their marriage, it was supposed to be a celebration, a story of two people finding love after seasons of loss and heartbreak. But instead of being welcomed as a fairy tale ending, the marriage quickly became one of the most controversial moments in their lives. What should have been a joyous occasion was clouded by whispers, suspicion, and a flood of unanswered questions that refused to go away. For Lisa Weiss, Doug's ex-wife, the marriage wasn't just shocking, it was painful. After over 3 decades of life together, supporting his ministry, raising their children, and standing by his side, she suddenly found herself replaced in the public eye. It wasn't just the fact that Doug had remarried, but the speed of it. Barely months after their divorce papers were finalized, he was walking down the aisle again, this time with Joni, a woman who wasn't just anyone, but a well-known Christian broadcaster and the widow of Marcus Lamb. The timing was hard to ignore. People began asking questions almost immediately. How had Doug moved on so quickly? Had there been something happening between him and Joni long before the divorce? The way they seemed so comfortable with each other, so ready to start a new chapter, didn't look like the beginning of a brand new relationship. It looked rehearsed, like something that had already been in the works. Lisa herself admitted that her instincts told her this wasn't sudden. It felt planned, as though the seeds of this new relationship had been planted while she was still fighting for her marriage. To the public, the optics were troubling. Doug had built his reputation as a Christian marriage counselor, writing books, and speaking on stages about faithfulness, commitment, and fighting for your spouse. People admired him because they believed he lived out the values he preached. But when his marriage to Lisa collapsed quietly in the background, followed so quickly by his highly publicized wedding to Joni, that image cracked. If he hadn't been able to honor his own marriage, how could he claim to guide others in theirs? For Joni, the marriage also raised doubts. She had lost Marcus, her husband and co-founder of Daystar, only a short time earlier. Many in her audience sympathized deeply with her grief and admired her for carrying on his legacy. But when she remarried Doug so quickly, the sympathy began to turn into skepticism. Some felt she had moved on too fast, while others wondered whether her relationship with Doug had already begun before Marcus had even passed away. In Christian circles, where appearances and timing carry a heavy weight, those doubts hit hard. Behind the polished photos and smiling announcements, there were personal fractures too. Members of Joanne's own family reportedly struggled with the marriage. Her children, still grieving the loss of their father, felt as though their mother had rushed into something new before they could even begin to process their own pain. To them, it wasn't just about their mother's happiness. It was about loyalty to the legacy Marcus had built and the values their family had always stood for. The controversy only grew as stories began to circulate about phone calls, arguments, and the hidden sides of Joni that few had ever seen. Lisa herself shared that she once spoke to Joni directly and was stunned by the anger she heard. A tone far different from the calm, composed personality viewers knew from television. Those stories added fuel to the fire, painting a picture of a union that wasn't built purely on healing and love, but on secrecy, tension, and unresolved conflicts. The church community was split. Some defended the couple, saying grief doesn't follow a clear timeline and that both Doug and Joni deserved a second chance at happiness. Others weren't so forgiving. To them, the marriage represented hypocrisy, a counselor who couldn't keep his own vows, and a Christian leader who seemed to abandon her family's mourning for the sake of a new relationship. Social media filled with debates, comment sections turned into battlegrounds, and YouTube videos dissected every timeline, every photo, and every statement the couple made. For Doug, the silence was telling. He didn't address Lisa's pain publicly, nor did he speak about the quick shift from one marriage to another. He carried on with his work, writing and speaking as though nothing had changed. But in that silence, people filled the gaps with their own assumptions, and those assumptions weren't kind. They wondered if Doug had been emotionally unfaithful long before the papers were signed, if his words about covenant love were just part of the polished image he sold to the world. For Joni, the marriage raised deeper questions about her leadership at Daystar. The network had been built on values of faith, family, and loyalty, values that now seemed to clash with her personal choices. Some longtime supporters began to distance themselves. No longer sure if they could trust the leadership that once seemed so steady, donations reportedly began to waver, and the credibility of the network itself was put at risk. The marriage that was supposed to symbolize healing and new beginnings instead became a flashpoint for division. It stirred conversations not only about Doug and Joanne's personal lives, but about the larger issue of integrity and leadership. Could a ministry survive when its leaders were under this kind of scrutiny? Could trust be rebuilt when the timeline of love and loyalty didn't add up? In the end, the marriage raised more questions than answers. Was it love born out of grief, or was it something that had been hidden long before the public ever saw it? Was it a fresh start, or the final chapter of secrets that could no longer stay buried? For Lisa, for their families, and for the thousands who had once looked up to Doug and Joni, the wedding bells didn't bring closure. They brought a storm, one that left everyone questioning what was real, what was staged, and what had been lost in the rush to move forward. When the news of Doug Weiss and Joni Lamb's marriage broke, it spread like wildfire. At first, the headlines made it look like a story of redemption. Two people who had gone through loss and heartache finding love again. But very quickly, the shine wore off and the reality set in. What people saw didn't match what they had been told for years, and the public fallout was loud, emotional, and unavoidable. Doug had spent decades building his reputation as a marriage counselor. He was the man who told couples to fight for their relationships, to never give up on their vows, to put in the hard work no matter how difficult it got. His books were sold in churches, his advice was quoted by pastors, and his presence on TV made him look like the ultimate example of a faithful Christian husband. That was the brand. That was the image people bought into. So when Lisa, his wife of more than 30 years, suddenly disappeared from the picture, and within months, Doug was standing beside Joni, it didn't just look strange. It looked hypocritical. How could the man who had told countless couples to hang on through the storms have given up on his own marriage so quickly? And how could he so easily step into a new relationship while Lisa was left behind, still grieving the loss of the life they had built? The Christian community felt betrayed. For so long they had trusted Doug's words. But now those words felt hollow. Pastors who had once invited him to speak quietly hold his name from their event lineups. Churches stopped recommending his books. For many, it wasn't about the fact that he remarried. It was about how fast it all happened, how little it seemed to honor the vows he had once called sacred. Joni wasn't spared from the backlash either. As Marcus Lamb's widow, she had been seen as a symbol of strength and faith, carrying on the mission of Daystar after his death. People respected her, felt compassion for her grief, and rallied around her when she stepped into leadership. But when she remarried Doug so soon after Marcus' passing, that respect turned into suspicion. Viewers who had once admired her began questioning her judgment. Some even wondered if her relationship with Doug had begun before Marcus was gone. The whispers grew louder, turning into accusations. Social media became a battlefield. On one side, there were people defending Doug and Joni, saying they were human, that grief has no timeline, and that they deserved happiness. On the other side, critics called them hypocrites, accusing them of betraying their families, their faith, and the very values they had built their careers on. Every photo of them together was dissected. Every public statement was met with skepticism. And then came Lisa's voice, calm, steady, but full of heartbreak. She began to share her side of the story. She talked about how she had supported Doug for decades, raised their children, and stood by while he traveled the world, teaching others how to save their marriages. She revealed the loneliness she felt, the emotional neglect, the way he seemed more present for strangers than for his own wife. Her words struck a chord. People began to see the story differently, not as a fairy tale romance, but as a story of betrayal and silence. The hypocrisy wasn't just in Doug's quick remarrage. It was in the way both he and Joni seemed to carry on as though nothing was wrong, smiling for cameras, posting polished photos, and presenting themselves as a power couple while ignoring the pain their actions had caused. To many, it looked like they were more interested in protecting their brand than living with integrity. Supporters of Daystar began to pull back. Donations dipped, viewership waned, and critics outside the Christian world seized the opportunity to point out the double standards. Here was a ministry built on faith, family, and loyalty, now fronted by a couple whose actions seemed to contradict those very values. For skeptics, it was proof of everything they had always said about religious leaders being more concerned with image than truth. The fallout wasn't just about reputations. It was about trust. Trust that taken decades to build was shattered in a matter of months. And in Christian communities, once trust is broken, it's nearly impossible to restore. People felt deceived, like they had been sold an image that didn't match reality. Doug and Joni's silence only made it worse. Instead of addressing the concerns directly, they pressed forward, leaving the questions unanswered and the doubts unresolved. The hypocrisy people saw wasn't abstract. It was personal. Couples who had sat in Doug's counseling sessions now wondered if his advice had ever been real. Viewers who had admired Joni's strength after Marcus's death now questioned whether she had been genuine. For Lisa, it was painful validation. The loneliness she had lived in quietly for years was now visible to the world. And the fallout showed just how deep the wounds ran. In the end, the public backlash wasn't just about a marriage. It was about credibility, about whether faith leaders could truly live up to the values they preached. Doug and Joni's story, once painted as redemption, had become a symbol of hypocrisy, leaving a community divided, disappointed, and asking whether the people they trusted most had been honest with them at all. Lisa's decision to finally speak out changed everything. For years, she had been in the shadows, standing quietly behind Doug Weiss while he built his career as a trusted voice in Christian counseling. She was the supportive wife, the one who raised the children, ran the home, and made sure everything stayed in order. While Doug traveled, preached, and told others how to love their spouses better to the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple, an example of loyalty, teamwork, and faith. But when Lisa finally opened her mouth and shared her truth, that image began to collapse, and the divide it created was impossible to ignore. When Lisa first started sharing, her words didn't come across as angry attacks. She didn't scream or curse. She spoke with a kind of quiet pain, the kind that builds over decades. When someone feels unseen and unheard, she told stories about how Doug had grown more distant over the years, how she often felt invisible in her own home, and how the man who preached about cherishing your spouse didn't even look her in the eye when he walked through the door. Her honesty cut deep because it wasn't exaggerated. It sounded real. It was raw in a way that people couldn't easily dismiss. The Christian community had always held Doug up as a man of integrity. His books were sold in churches. His talks were replayed in conferences. His advice shaped marriages all over the country. But Lisa's words cracked that image wide open. Suddenly, people were forced to ask themselves hard questions. If Doug couldn't live by the very principles he preached, then what did that mean for all the couples who had trusted his guidance? If his own marriage ended not with reconciliation, but with a quick remarriage to Joni Lamb, was he ever the man they thought he was? As Lisa's story spread online, the reactions were polarizing. On one side, there was an outpouring of support. Strangers reached out to her, women who had been through similar situations, thanking her for her courage and saying her words gave them strength. To them, Lisa wasn't bitter or vengeful. She was brave. She was the voice for all the women who had been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced in their own marriages. She became a kind of symbol, not because she wanted to be, but because people needed someone to show them that telling the truth was possible, even when it was painful. On the other side, though, there was backlash. Some accused Lisa of trying to ruin Doug's reputation. They called her jealous, bitter, and unwilling to move on. Others said she should have stayed quiet, that airing private struggles in public was unchristian and destructive. The divide between supporters and critics grew quickly. And the conversation around Lisa wasn't just about her anymore. It was about bigger questions. Questions of faith, integrity, and whether Christian leaders should be held to a higher standard in their personal lives. Lisa's voice exposed something deeper than one broken marriage. It revealed how much of the Christian community had been built on appearances. People began to realize how often they had believed what they saw on stage, without questioning what might be happening behind closed doors. Lisa wasn't trying to destroy anyone, but by simply telling her truth, she forced people to confront a reality that made them uncomfortable. Sometimes the leaders they admire most are not who they appear to be. What made Lisa's words so powerful was the contrast to Doug and Joni's silence. While Lisa opened her heart, sharing her pain and admitting her brokenness, Doug and Joni stayed polished and guarded. They smiled for cameras, gave no real explanations, and carried on as though nothing was wrong. That silence to many looked like avoidance, and the more they stayed quiet, the more Lisa's voice stood out. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was the only story people could hold on to. The divide grew sharper within churches and online communities. Some pastors defended Doug, saying everyone makes mistakes, and that grace should be extended. They argued that Lisa was hurting and that her perspective was colored by pain. Others, however, saw her as a truth teller, someone shining a light on hypocrisy. They said that grace doesn't excuse double standards, and that leaders who teach one thing while living another should be held accountable. In many ways, Lisa became the voice that exposed the fracture lines in the community itself. Supporters rallied around her, creating conversations about emotional neglect, the role of women in ministry families, and the hidden cost of being married to someone in the spotlight. Critics doubled down, warning that too much attention on her words could damage ministries and turn people away from faith. What started as one woman's story became a larger debate about transparency, accountability, and what it really means to live out faith in private life. For Lisa personally, the experience was both painful and freeing. She had carried her silence for so long, convincing herself that protecting Doug's image was more important than protecting her own heart. But the moment she finally spoke, it was like a weight lifted.